Shall we get started, David?
Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Well, welcome everyone. I see we have a audience signed in for this Zoom seminar. This is a little bit of a unique seminar because we don't have a live speaker. What we're doing today is we have a series of 3 small talks that were presented at the KGML workshop held in Minneapolis. Well, it's actually held as a Zoom meeting in August, and it covered different topics associated with machine learning, but what we call knowledge-guided machine learning, where you combine the applications or the capabilities of machine learning with either physics or biology knowledge, or could be social knowledge and so on if you want to expand out that far. But here we were looking at scientific domains, including the aquatic biology and hydrology, atmospheric sciences, and transformational biology. This was held in the middle of August. I think it was 18th, 19th of August, or 18th through the 20th of August. And there is a website for this, and all of the presentations, except for one, I believe, that were given at that, are on a website that I will share the link to on chat. So I haven't put that on chat just yet, but I will while the first speaker is talking. And then, you can look that up, and on there you can look at all these videos. They're all YouTube videos. So now I have 3 presentations. The first one is by Paul Hansen, and the second is by Robert Ludwig, and the third one is by Chirikulika Varadhajan. I have a hard time saying that last name, but the first presentation will be very short. It's an introduction by Paul Hansen, and Paul is a distinguished research professor at the Center for Limnology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's the director of that center. And so he led this first session of the workshop on aquatic biology. So I'm going to get this started. If at the end of this one, I'm going to take a moment just to see if there's any questions, not that I'm going to be able to answer them, but just to see what kind of questions come up. And then I'm going to set it up for Robert Ludwig's presentation, which follows right after this one.
For those of us who began working with Vipin Kumar and his group a few years ago, this was one of those rare and treasured aha moments for us. It was an aha moment when we learned that decades of hard research or hard work we put into our research that's instantiated in the models that we use to model our ecosystems wasn't going to be replaced by machine learning, but in fact had something to give to machine learning, to make machine learning even
John, don't mute yourself.
machine learning, we can do better than either one of those in terms of model performance. The predictions are better. Predictions outside of sample are better. We can conform to physical laws and ecological principles that we think are important. And from an ecologist perspective, it's really important to feed back our knowledge of the system. So we've also learned that we can learn things about our model and therefore about the underlying theory that goes into those models. You're going to hear a lot about water quality today. So why water quality? All of our futures depend on water quality. The sustainability of the planet depends on fresh water and its availability. We do know that water quality is diminishing globally, but we've kind of a poor quantification of the state of ecosystems around the globe. And we just are beginning to understand what, especially at broad space and time scales, is affecting changes in water quality. Most of the estimates that we have of water quality are empirical in nature and from statistical models at broad space and time scales. And yet we have a lot of rich information about ecosystems, and we've developed a lot of process-based and physical models too, but they tend to be applied at the local level. And why is this a particularly good problem for KGML? Well, there are a lot of lakes in the world. In the US, there are about 7 million lakes, and across the globe, there are about 120 million lakes. But not very many of these systems actually have data. The data are sparse, they're highly heterogeneous, and they conform pretty much to a power distribution, which means that a few of the lakes have almost all the data, and most lakes have very little data at all. Water quality in lakes is an emergent property of ecosystems. It derives from the interactions of the physics and the chemistry and the biology of the systems, external controls and internal feedbacks. They're space and time scale dependent. And so that makes them really challenging to predict for process models or for black box models as well. And of course, we're always looking for an evolution of methods that maps onto the available resources or the resources that become available to us. KGML sits in a programmatic sense within the broader topic of harnessing the data revolution. And I've listed here on the screen a number of features of the harnessing the data revolution that include human resources right over to research. You'll hear some talks today that talk specifically about process modeling and machine learning in KGML. But KGML is pretty new to our field. And so some of the talks today will deal with other aspects of harnessing the data revolution. The important thing to remember is that these diversity of ideas and diversity of input should inspire, I think, more questions than we have answers. And so there are great opportunities here to think about the ways we all may collaborate on some of these issues. I'm going to switch gears and give you a specific example of the implementation of KGML in a lake, Lake Mendota, Wisconsin, which is in Madison. And it's a pretty simple example. It models lake phosphorus. Phosphorus is a limiting nutrient for primary production in lakes and is responsible at high concentrations for harmful algal blooms and other water quality problems. This bar that you see at the top is a picture of the surface of Lake Mendota, which is covered in a scum of algae. And even though we know a lot about phosphorus dynamics in lakes, we really haven't done much prediction over scales that range from the short time scale, let's say days, up to decades. And so we thought we'd give that a go. So our goal here was to improve predictions over these broad time scales in this lake. And we used 3 different approaches: process-only model, recurrent neural network, and then of course combining those two to create the KGML. Process model was a very typical approach that we would use in modeling biogeochemistry in a lake. This is a schematic of a lake during the summertime when it's thermally stratified. The upper layer of the lake is warm. It's called the uplimnion. It's where we would swim. The lower layer in the lake is called the hypolimnion. It's cold. And when it becomes anoxic, it is a place where cold water fish species end up dying. And the third layer in the system here is the sediments. So phosphorus comes in from the catchment. It is processed within the lake. Some of it is stored, some of it's recycled, some of it's exported downstream. And our goal is to try to understand those dynamics. So we have a process model, but we also have the machine learning only model. In this case, it's a recurrent neural network. It takes the observational data, all these different time series, runs them through the RNN to make a set of predictions. Pretty straightforward from a machine learning perspective. What makes it KGML is we take the output of the process model and we provide it as another input for the recurrent neural network. But also we enforce an ecological principle on the right-hand side here of the objective function or the loss function as the model tries to fit the data. The ecological principle we're enforcing here is called -1 log-log scaling. It's very common to environmental data that most of the power is in long time scales and there's less power in short time scales. This power distribution then is enforced within this modeling paradigm to make sure the predictions from the neural network create a power distribution that's pretty similar to what we have in the observational data. So let's go straight to the results. So we have three different rows of results here. The top row is the process only. The middle row is recurrent neural network only, and then the bottom row is the KGML. This black line is the observational data in all the different plots, and it's the signal we're trying to recreate. Phosphorus in Lake Mendota is highly dynamic with a very strong annual signal to it. It's highest in the winter, it's lowest in the summer. We're particularly interested in predicting summer values well, because that's when harmful algal blooms occur. The process-only model does a pretty good job of capturing the annual dynamics in the system, but it misses some of these high events early in the time series, and then decades later, misses some of the lower events. This doesn't look like much, but this turns out to be a significant miss on the predictions. The recurrent neural network does a better job than the process model by quite a bit, actually. But you'll see a lot of high frequency jitter in the recurrent neural network, and values that, when you look at them closely, don't represent realistic changes in the system. Naturally, the PGML gives us the best predictions. It's a little bit hard to see and appreciate here, and I think it's demonstrated a little bit better on the right side, even though these are statistically significant better results in the left. On the right, we have the seasonal time series for winter and summer over the 20 years. And the process-only model does a pretty good job of giving some of the time dynamics, but look, it missed entirely the long-term trend that's in the system, both true for summer and winter. The recurrent neural network did a better job of picking up the long-term trend, although it didn't quite get it here, but definitely missed some of the important changes we're seeing in summer over the 2 decades. And the PGRNN, or the KGML approach, pretty much nailed the long-term trend and gave us the best dynamics in the system. So what did we learn? This is my last slide here, wrapping up. KGML provided feedback on the ecosystem process. Although I didn't show these results, the process model was the most important predictor for the KGML paradigm. However, it did downweight it by about 20% and reassigned some of the variants we thought should go to process into temperature. So we learned something about our model, that maybe we didn't even have exactly the right model and we could make some changes there. KGML was the most accurate in making its predictions, and it also gave us some information about some of our next steps that you'll hear a little bit about in some of the other presentations. But I think the final take-home point I want to make is we've learned a lot through this process and through our collaborations with our colleagues in computer science, and there's huge room for development and application of KGML framework for all of us. It's a really exciting time to be in the aquatic sciences. So thank you, and we'll switch over to Robert.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Okay, hello everybody.
Okay, so that was the first presentation by Paul Hansen, and just so everybody knows, the speakers throw around PGML and KGML. They're basically the same thing, except for PGML means physics-guided machine learning, and KGML means knowledge-guided machine learning. So maybe some applications don't have any physics in them, and so saying it's physically guided machine learning might be a misnomer. So in general, KGML, knowledge-guided, would include physics as well as other kinds of things such as biological principles and so forth. So Robert is a postdoc at the Center for Limnology at University of Wisconsin-Madison. And here he's going to be talking about the model for oxygen dynamics.
So I hope you can see that. My name is Robert Ludwig, and I want to talk about an ongoing research project that we are doing at UW-Madison. So in collaboration with the USGS and the University of Minnesota, we are currently also doing the modeling of lake oxygen dynamics. So here the concentrations of dissolved oxygen, or DO, in lakes, of course, depend on the abundance of sources and synchrons. And here in lake sources can be, for example, photosynthesis or the exchange with the atmosphere. Whereas sinks can be the mineralization of organic matter, redox reactions, or just a depletion by the sediment. And most lakes in these climate zones here, they stratify during summer, which means that we have warm water on top of cold water. So as you can see here on this bottom plot, this shows you like the typical dynamics of oxygen as a heat map. So the x-axis is the time, and the y-axis is the depth, and the color shows you the concentration of oxygen from a high value in yellow to a one close to zero in dark blue.
Just a note here, they found out that his slides weren't going forward, and so that will be corrected in just a moment. I didn't want to cut out that very first part for his explanation.
And now in June, we have stratified conditions, which mean we have the warm water on top of the cold water. And here the surface warm water layer is also called the epilimnion, and this cold bottom layer is called the hypolimnion. And due to this formation of two distinct layers, we have very low. Oh, yeah.
I'm still seeing your title slide. I don't know if that's true.
Well, it worked before, I swear.
It worked before.
So, can you see it?
I see your title slide.
You shared window to the front. I'm really sorry for that. Let me try this again.
Now I see your second slide.
Now you can see it?
Yes. Sorry.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is the figure I talked about for like a minute now. So you can see the surface layer and the bottom layer. And because we have the formation of these two distinct layers, there is a low transport going on between them because we have a low vertical diffusivity, which means in the bottom layer, we have a depletion of oxygen. So we have very low concentrations because there is no source available. And as you can see here in lakes, oxygen has dynamics, at least a seasonal one due to stratification. And also the depletion of oxygen is an emergent ecosystem property, which means it's really hard to predict because it depends on multiple factors like the catchment, the climate, or the biomass in the lake. So this is our first research question. So what is driving the different dynamics of oxygen on different timescales? And do these drivers change over the different timescales? So for example, on daily timescales, you could have wind-induced turbulence that drives oxygen. On a seasonal timescale, you could have stratification. On a year-to-year timescale, you could have the impact of, for example, flash floods or extreme events. And on decadal timescale, you could have climate change or a shift in the ecosystem that is driving oxygen. And also in this project, we wanted to look at the oxygen dynamics in lakes in Wisconsin. So we are really lucky here because we have the NTL-LGR program, which is a monitoring program which is active since the 1980s. So we have long-term data sets about our lakes here. So these lake ecosystems are well understood and studied systems. So in this study, we included 5 lakes from the north. These are nutrient-poor lakes that are influenced by a forest catchment. And we also added 4 lakes from the south. These are nutrient-rich lakes, and they are heavily influenced by an urban and agricultural catchment. So our main research question here was, what is driving the difference between the rural northwoods against the urban south? And for this, we built a process-based oxygen model, which we call ODEM, which is short for Oxygen Depletion Model. And so next 10 minutes, I want to talk about this process-based model. And at the end, I want to talk about potential links to machine learning. So in this process-based model, we either assume that the lake is stratified or mixed. So in summer, we assume stratified conditions, which means we are quantifying an oxygen concentration in the surface layer. And we are also quantifying one in the bottom layer. And as you can see on the left side, all these concentrations are influenced by different flux terms. For example, the exchange with the atmosphere, the net ecosystem production, or also a transport between the top and the bottom. And there's also a sink by the sediment. But once the layer shifts to mixed conditions, we only have one layer. So we are only tracking down the total dissolved oxygen concentration. And here, this ordinary differential equation is just expressed at the end as a set of linear difference equations. So how does ODIM work? So as input data, we have the results from a very well calibrated hydrodynamic model done by GLM. And this model predicts the water temperature profiles over the depth on a daily basis. It's temperature data to quantify if the lake is stratified or mixed, and also how much volume is in the top and in the bottom layer. We are also feeding into ODIM lake-specific data like the area-to-depth relationship, and also meteorological data like wind speed and air temperature. And at the end, at the bottom, you can see how ODIM works. For example, at the beginning, the lake could be completely mixed, so we only quantify one oxygen concentration. Then summer kicks in, so now we have two layers. We have the surface and the bottom layer. And at the end, we have again a shift to completely mixed conditions. At this moment, we are ignoring winter stratification dynamics in this process-based model. So how do we do the model fitting? So all these fluxes I have shown earlier, they all depend on an ideal flux rate, which we call flux 20, which is kind of a black box. So we are using STAN, which is an Bayesian statistical model to estimate these flux 20 parameters by running multiple chains of the model again and again. And every time when we had a new observed data point for oxygen, we estimated these flux 20 parameters again, and also when there was a shift from stratified to mixed conditions or vice versa. And here to do this all in a Bayesian way, we also assumed at the beginning that all these flux 20 parameters follow a normal distribution, and that every subsequent estimation of these flux 20 parameters depends on the prior mean. And in this way, we implemented some kind of random walk into the model fitting. So each lake was fitted specifically with this Bayesian model, and we got very well replications of the oxygen dynamics for each lake. And I want to show you like the first results for time series fits. So here you can see the time series of Lake Mendota. So every plot shows you 1 year. The x-axis is the day of the year, and the y-axis is the oxygen concentration. Here the lines show you the modeled results, and the dots show you the observed data. And red is the surface layer, green the bottom layer, and blue dots are observed data points during mixed conditions. And as you can see here for this Lake Mendota, the results are very good. So our model replicates the dynamics of oxygen very well. If we quantify the fit for all the lakes, as you can see here on the right side with a plot of the next subgroup coefficient of efficiency on the x-axis against the root mean squared error on the y-axis, most of our lakes have an NSE above 0.85, so a really good fit. And also the RMSE is below 1 milligram per liter. We only have one outlier, which is on the top right. This is Lake Vinkwa, which mixes often during summer. It's also nutrient rich and is a very shallow lake. And so now we know that these configurations of lake systems, they don't work with our process-based model. So this is a really important limitation that we now know. So I want to show some results of the process-based modeling. So here you can see the total sum of all the fluxes over 1 year. So the seasonal dynamics of this total flux, which is the total net ecosystem production. So to simplify this, if this value is above 0, we have a storage of carbon in the lake, or if it's below 0, the lake is emitting carbon into the environment. And here the solid lines show you the northern lakes, and the dotted lines show you the southern lakes. And you can really see that these two catchments are distinct to each other. So at about day 150, we have a huge negative flux in the southern lake. So they are emitting carbon into the environment. And this is like in late spring, early summer. And then if you go to summer, first the northern lakes peak, and then the southern lakes peak. So they are then storing carbon. And at the end in fall, all these lakes have a negative flux again. But still you can see these lakes are really different to each other, which is due to the catchment and also the lake type. This was like one of the early interesting findings we got for Wisconsin. And we also tried to generalize the patterns of how fast does the oxygen depletion happen. So here on the left side, you can see, or please remember that sometimes the green line goes like really fast or sometimes really low, so the concentration at the bottom. And now we cluster these responses over time. So this big plot shows you the oxygen concentration on the y-axis against the time of summer. So the x-axis goes from 0 to 100% of summer is over. And the southern lakes mostly have this yellow response, which is a convex response. So they have an early high depletion, and at about 50% of summer, the oxygen concentrations are nearly depleted and they stay low. Whereas most northern lakes have this concave response, so they have high concentration throughout the middle of summer, and then the depletion kicks in. So the first results showed us that these lake types are really different and that we can learn a lot about how they work in general. But now we would love to advance our ecosystem understanding. So we have this process-based model that replicates the data very well, but it doesn't include all the important processes because it's simplified. And we also have lots of monitoring data from our LTER program. So now we want to dig deeper and explore more of our data set. And we have two big questions. The first one is, what are the causal relationships between the different drivers or variables? And also, what are the important empirical relationships that we have neglected now, but they could be important for the next iteration of ODEM? And of course, there are like all these classical approaches, but we now would want to apply machine learning. So we tried two things for now. We did causal networking. So we used the PCMCI algorithm to create this causal dependency structure. So you can see how different water quality variables depend on each other. So a line shows you the dependency. If it's red, there is more or less a positive correlation. If it's blue, there's a negative one. And the number shows the lag. And here you can see, like for the surface layer, phosphorus, nitrogen, algae biomass, light extinction, the flux of net ecosystem production, and also organic carbon. And we just did this for Lake Mendota as the first try attempt. And we could learn a lot about the temporal relationship. For example, there's a strong correlation between the ecosystem production and the algae biomass, as well as the light extinction, which was expected. And there's also a strong inverse relationship between the ecosystem production and the nutrients. So we would like to dig into this more and to advance this to really understand the temporal relationships. The second thing that we tried was to use a recurrent neural network. And in this case, our flux20 parameter, so the parameters, so the ones that were calibrated for our process-based model, were now used as our targets. And using this RNN, we now wanted to see which ones of the input variables are important or sensitive. And here on the lower right, you can see a first result. So the RNN is able to replicate the dynamics of the NEP20 parameter, so the net ecosystem production. And we also did like a really simple sensitivity study, and we got to know that for the NEP20 predictions, the air temperature, the thermocline depth, and the phosphorus in the bottom layer were the most important ones. So this is also a really interesting first result that we could use to advance our process-based model for the next step. So yeah, currently we are here. We want to really advance what we can learn about oxygen depletions. We have all the results from the process-based modeling, plus more and more data from our long-term data set. So we know the groundwater table and we know nutrient concentrations in the inflow. And now we also would like to hear your feedback, what you think is a good approach, what is a good framework to either use data-driven modeling or approaches like causal networks, or maybe use machine learning to discover like processes that we have to use in the next iteration of ODEM. Because in the next step, we want to scale up from Wisconsin to the continental US scale. So we want to go from 9 lakes to 1,000 or more. And here, new points of focus will be to look at winter dynamics, which is, of course, more important on the continental scale. And we also want to use knowledge-guided machine learning for oxygen. So what Paul explained before for phosphorus, we also want to use this now for oxygen to learn more and to improve our predictions. So yeah, to sum up, at the beginning, we know a lot about the different drivers of oxygen on different timescales. So we built this process-based Bayesian hydrodynamic water quality model, which was calibrated very well and also replicates the lakes very well. Plus, we have all these long-term monitoring data sets. So now we are looking for the best sustainable data-driven framework to get to know these causal relationships and also to discover new or important hidden processes. And at the end, in the future, the next study, we want to scale up to do large-scale KGML modeling for oxygen. So yeah, that's the ODEM project. And yeah, thank you a lot for your attention.
Thanks, Robert.
Okay, so I think, I can't really answer questions about this. If people have questions, the speakers have agreed, not to me, but to the workshop organizers, that they would answer questions. If people have questions, they can send questions directly to the speakers, and they would supposedly reply back. One of the things I think that is pointed out here is that, as Paul indicated, there are something like 7 million lakes across the United States, and that what Robert is claiming or is proposing is to be able to develop a KGML model that would be able to learn information so it can simulate conditions on lakes that have data as well as lakes that don't have data. Most lakes don't have data, as Paul said. It's a very power law driven thing as far as where the data are available. We see a similar kind of drive in the field of hydrology to try to develop hydrologic models that will do a better job of predicting conditions in ungauged watersheds. So I'm going to move on to the next presentation, and this will take me a moment because I have to find the location of it in this overall video. And I do know the time that it's supposed to start, so I'll probably not be exactly right, but I'll be close. All right, so this next presentation is by Charuleka Harajan. She's at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, and her talk is about data-driven approaches to building efficient machine learning models for aquatic science and hydrology.
Arjan from Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to present. This has been a really great session and really great talks. So I'm Charu Vardarajan, and I'm a research scientist in the Earth and Environmental Sciences area at Berkeley Lab. And my scientific expertise is in using data-driven methods for studying water resources. And I'm also involved in a number of other data science efforts with the US Department of Energy. I'm also a senior fellow at the Berkeley Institute of Data Sciences. So this talk today represents the work of several people. I've been really lucky to work with interdisciplinary teams. It's one of the perks of working in the national lab. And several of my co-authors are from the computing sciences area in the lab. And in particular, I want to acknowledge Julie Mueller and her postdocs, Ritik Sahu and Django Park, who really did much of the machine learning I'm going to be talking about today. Okay, so we're now collecting water data at an increasingly rapid pace, and machine learning is already transforming how we're making predictions in very complex systems such as watersheds and river basins. So in the past couple of years, the field of machine learning for aquatic science and hydrology has just exploded, and it's been a very exciting time. But water data today, as we've heard even earlier in this session, is really heterogeneous. We have multi-scale, multidisciplinary data, and we ideally want to make use of all data that's available to make predictions. But right now, our ability to use machine learning is limited when we're trying to diversify the types of data we're using, because our approaches to building models are brute force and inefficient, and kind of rely on trying out the kitchen sink approach, where we try everything out to achieve the best prediction accuracy. So if we want to make predictions at scale for a variety of problems, let's see, my clicks here not working. Oops. Sorry about that. Okay, here we go. We need to think about reducing the computational and human overhead of building machine learning models without sacrificing accuracy. So today I'm going to talk about a few approaches we're using in 2 projects to address this challenge. So the first approach is to make mathematical improvements, which is what we're doing for a project that uses surrogate models combined with machine learning to predict groundwater levels in California. And this research was motivated by California's historic Sustainable Groundwater Management Act that requires local agencies to manage their groundwater sustainably and reduce undesirable impacts. So although some parts of the state, such as the Central Valley, have decades of work building multi-physics, multi-scale models, most other parts of California don't really have such models available, and typically the smaller agencies don't even have access to supercomputer resources. So our research objective here was to build fast, efficient neural network-based models that could replace these computationally expensive, high-fidelity models to enable stakeholders to make timely decisions for groundwater management just on their laptops. So we started off with building deep learning models for some wells in Butte County, which is in Northern California. And we primarily chose this region because there was data available there. And by high resolution data, what we mean is actually daily data for groundwater and meteorology. And data availability turned out to be a pretty big challenge, because that wasn't the original region we would have targeted. We were originally eyeing something like the Salinas Basin, which is a high priority basin for the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. But when we looked at the data there were only 2 data points a year. So we had to end up sort of switching. And by the time we actually ended up doing our analysis of the papers, actually the water withdrawals in Butte were high enough that it ended up becoming a high priority station for place for Sigma. So that's good for us, but very unfortunate for the residents of Butte County. So we considered 4 different popular neural network model choices here: the multi-layer perceptron, the convolutional neural network, and the recurrent neural network and its variant, the LSTM, which we thought would be good fits. The last 2 would be good fits for the modeling the temporal dynamics of the system. And each of these models had different hyperparameters to tune, and these hyperparameters determine the network's learning capacity and prediction capacity. So an important hyperparameter that we decided to include here to account for all the memory effects that happen in groundwater systems is the lag. And the lag here is the number of past observations that could influence the next day's values. So all in all, when we started to look at all the different hyperparameters and the ranges that we would want to consider, we realized that actually would end up with hundreds of thousands to millions of potential combinations to hand tune, which obviously was very computationally expensive. So Julie had developed previously a black box optimization approach that uses surrogate probabilistic models, which are namely radial basis functions and Gaussian process models, to converge to the ideal hyperparameter space much more quickly. And so we published this in a recent paper. And after we did develop that HBO approach, we also set up the models using 5 different input features that included for the training and for the hyperparameter optimization. So this was prior groundwater level measurements, temperature, precipitation, the nearest river discharge that was sort of supposed to be indicative of surface groundwater exchange, and the week of the year, which was supposed to capture the seasonality. And for the out-of-sample predictions, we only used the temperature and precip data to generate the predictions, and these were applied to single and multi-well scenarios. So we had a roughly 60-20-20 split for the training, the testing for the hyperparameter optimization, and then the out-of-sample prediction range. So the results here shows that surprisingly, it was actually, we didn't expect this, that the multi-layer perceptron actually outperformed all the other models. And this was about 4 to 6 layers here. And it was not just in terms of prediction error here. It was also in terms of computational expense, the multilayer perceptron was about an order of magnitude less than the other models. And the key turned out to be this optimal selection of these hyperparameters. So in particular, for instance, these LSTMs and recurrent neural networks that we thought would do well actually couldn't capture a longer lag time. So they sort of stopped working when you had a lag of over 60 days. But these MLP and the convolutional neural network were able to account for about a year's worth of prior history, which it turns out to be really important in predicting groundwater system. So the other thing we realized is that we had to run several trials for this optimization because the results were slightly different depending on the random seed for the surrogate model. But so there's some stochasticity in the model itself. But overall, we got pretty good predictions for all the different ensemble runs here for up to a year's worth. So we were just predicting the next day's value and using the prediction to keep predicting the future values. So this was up to a year out, we could predict fairly well. Right. Seems to be, okay, oops, that's great, too much. All right, so here, I just want to slide here. We actually also then did some follow-on work to explore the influence of differences in input features on the prediction outcomes, partly to see whether we could reduce the amount of time it took to train the model by dropping features, and also because we anticipate some data, such as the discharge, won't be available everywhere at the desired resolutions or periods of time monitored. So we had 9 different scenarios for 3 groundwater wells in Butte, Shasta, and Tehama counties, which are high, medium, and low sigma priority basins based on their water withdrawals here. And these are all the different scenarios that we ran. So the take-home message here is we had 2 major conclusions. The first is that the hydrological variables, which are primarily the precip and the discharge, are essential to obtain good predictions. If we drop both of them, such as this groundwater temperature scenario, the errors really shoot up. So that being said, it's also not necessary to use all the available data for all locations. So for example, discharge, which is the surface groundwater exchange, turned out to be less influential in the Butte region, where groundwater pumping dominates the water balance over everything. So this is all sort of jiving with our hydrological understanding of the system. So to sort of summarize this approach, there are 2 key messages here. First is that the automated hyperparameter optimization approach dramatically increases the efficiency of building the models and allows us to explore a much larger parameter space without hand-tuning everything. And also based on a parameter sensitivity test, it's promising that the obvious hydrological variable choice that we would go after turned out to be the most predictive, but it's also interesting that the choice of variables that gives the best performance varies by location, which is what we would intuitively expect based on our knowledge of hydrology. So this indicates that there's potential for just not using all the data that's available and throwing it at the model, but being clever about how we select some input features based on some hydrological understanding of the system. So I'm now going to switch gears and move to another project. So it's just taking a while to load. I'm not sure why. There we go. This is a project which is a DOE early career project, and it's mostly aspirational because it just got funded last September. But I'm going to be using a second approach that's really starting to think about how we can use knowledge-guided data science to do predictions of river water quality here. So the research objective is to understand the impacts of stream flow disturbances, both floods and droughts, to water quality here. And we'll be exploring whether we can infer knowledge about river corridor responses to disturbance as emergent properties that yield transferable insights using data-driven approaches as part of a framework to build better machine learning models. So this work is going to focus on 3 river corridors, the Delaware, and then the Colorado, as well as the Columbia rivers. These are important not just for the nation, but for the Department of Energy. And for this work, by water quality, I'm just referring to 3 different variables: temperature, dissolved oxygen, and conductivity, which are very important for water managers, but also from the machine learning perspective, they have high resolution data available. So the existing paradigm of using process-based models alone doesn't work to predict water quality across very large spatial scales, because we have really complex interactions that occur across space and time in watersheds. And the computational expense and the data that we would need to run such models just makes it very challenging to run. So here, there's this figure here that shows perhaps many different factors that really affect river water quality. And for each of these factors, we have many different data sets. So this can be a really big challenge. So what we're interested in doing is using machine learning, and particularly knowledge-guided machine learning, to think about how we can reduce this complexity for both short as well as long-term predictions. And so here, I'm going to cover 3 different science questions. Okay, so that are structured to add complexity. And sort of the science questions are the analogy of the shoe that Allison talked about. It's really a great analogy. We have to sort of tailor our models to be addressing these science questions. And so the first question is about how do disturbances impact water quality at a single location? So point to read scales at short and long time scales. The second starts to expand on the spatial scale and is focused on understanding the impacts downstream, along the river corridor and across river orders. And the third question then starts to broaden out to look at the landscape interactions with the rivers to determine how watershed properties can impact water quality. So ultimately, these questions seek to determine a resistance or resilience index of water quality as a function of disturbance and watershed properties. So my approach here is going to use a variety of data-driven methods for the predictions. And so recently there's been actually a growing number of studies that look at these long-term water monitoring data sets, and these have included classical approaches such as regression to determine long-term trends, identifying patterns in hydrogeochemical behavior, in this case using Boltzmann machines or convolutional neural networks, methods to use information theory or causal inferences, as we heard even earlier today, to determine the drivers behind observed variables, and finally using some of the data in machine learning, which is already just beginning to show a lot of promise. But however, to date, most of these data-driven approaches have been used mostly in isolation and make use of a limited amount of data, relying on one-off products that are not updated with new data. So there seems to be this opportunity here to think about this more holistically, using some of these analytical methods to understand the underlying phenomena and the emergent patterns to help us build better machine learning models that are more scalable, interpretable, and transferable. So my approach is to derive some physical information by using different types of data analysis to answer the different science questions. So here, for example, the first science question here, I'm looking to tease out some emergent properties such as resistance, which is a change of the signal after the disturbance, or the resilience, which is the ability of the system to bounce back after a disturbance, and the lagged effects of prior events and disturbances on water quality. So I'll be doing this analysis on multiple time scales using wavelet multi-resolution analysis. And the hypothesis here is just that these emergent properties can help determine which machine learning model architecture, features, and hyperparameters to choose. So for example, if a system has a very long lag, it seems like based on sort of our prior work, we can't just choose an LSTM since that may not be able to represent a sequence that long. But the lag can also become the hyperparameter that we have in the model. So other questions that we can ask are whether we need a single model for an entire basin or for all rivers, or whether we should have different models based on some inherent grouping that's either spatial by watersheds or temporal by some stochastic regimes. So the idea here is to then, sorry, it's taking a moment to load here. Is to build this data-driven framework that will contain an analytical module where the core elements are the outcomes of an analysis done for a particular science question, and ultimately build up the machine learning model for the prediction. So for example, here we're going to start with that same deep learning algorithm with the hyperparameter optimization for the point scale science question to predict at the point scale what the water quality is. But the framework is also going to have a data integration component here that pulls data from various sources on demand to make the data analysis repeatable, reproducible, and not based on one-off products. And just sort of given the diversity of data that's available and potentially usable in this research, this becomes really important to do because we need to try to make use of as much data as we have to arrive at the right results. So for this purpose, we're building a data integration piece of the framework as a base capability that allows us to pull in new data on demand. This is a software called Basin 3D that connects to diverse data sources and transforms data and metadata into a standardized format. So the software has two modes. The first is a Django-based tool that supports web services and portals for data discovery and visualization. We've done that for another project already. But for this early career work, we've extended the software to become an installable Python module that can flexibly connect to different data sources and be used for data analysis within a Jupyter notebook. So this harmonizes all the data into sort of a single data frame for the analysis, which seems to be truly unique because this then starts to deal with the problem of bringing data into a common format, which is just really a major pain point for building machine learning models. So to summarize here, what we're doing is to look ahead and move towards using a cascading series of data analysis to answer science questions or test hypotheses that provide us a more structured way of incorporating our domain knowledge in the machine learning. And ideally, that'll help us improve both the model accuracy as well as the time it takes to build these models. We're also building this software that will provide long-lasting capabilities to synthesize data into a uniform format and incorporate new data as they become available and reduce our reliance on these one-off data products. I just also, since we had a lot of questions earlier about extremes, I want to say that dealing with extremes has a lot of challenges. There's more missing data because there's less, there's more tendency for sensors to fail, and traditional error minimization approaches don't work. We have skewed distributions, etc. So to conclude, I want to just say that the key take-home message is that knowledge-guided machine learning is this unicorn space shown in this Venn diagram. It's the confluence of math, computer science, domain science. So in our projects, what we've done is to try to match up mathematical advances such as the hyperparameter optimization with some computational advances such as cyber infrastructure for model data integration and data pre-processing with the domain analysis to help inform the choice of model architecture and parameters. I'd also like to call out in general, we need more benchmark data to compare our models, and I would love to see some movement there to start to generate more fair data, which are machine-readable data products we can use for machine learning. And as we've heard from many of the great talks in this workshop, the important thing is to enable the collaborations by ensuring that all these partners across these disciplines are recognized and credited for moving this field forward. So with that, I just want to thank everybody for listening. I also happen to be looking for a postdoc, so please contact me if you're interested. And these are everybody I want to acknowledge, including my funding.
Baru, thank you. That was great. And another fantastic postdoc opportunity. Question for you. In groundwater level prediction, can you factor groundwater pumping rates as a predictor?
We would love to. There's no data on it. Unfortunately, California doesn't monitor pumping. We've tried a lot of different ways to estimate proxies for pumping.
Okay, I'm trying to stop this.
You'd think if anywhere would monitor pumping, it would be California. But I think maybe in the panel, we'll get back to what types of data we should be monitoring.
Just close the window at the upper right.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah. That was great. We're going to move on to our last talk. Next up is Xiaowei Jia from University of Pittsburgh.
Oh, geez. Okay. Please be patient with me.
Hello, everyone. This is Xiaowei. I just graduated from the University of Minnesota last month from Witness Group and joined the University of Pittsburgh as assistant professor in computer science. So I'm very happy to have this chance to give this talk in our HDR KGML workshop. And my talk today is about integrating physics into machine learning for monitoring scientific systems. So in these recent years, we have seen this machine learning and data mining, these techniques